Hey, and thanks for joining me for the 2021 NIETOC Extemp workshop. I'm Roby Holland. I'm the head coach of Plano West Speech and Debate. I'm a former extemper and the coach of several state and national champions in extemporaneous speaking. The subject of today's chat is going to be talking about and introducing advanced concepts in terms of structure for extemp speeches. You might have heard of this called substructure or microstructure on some of the ballots that you've received. Additionally, during this discussion, we're going to see an example speech from one of the current Plano West extempers in which she'll give a demo speech and then also break down the strategy that went into prepping that speech. So with all that in mind, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Give me just 1 second. Okay, great. Hopefully everyone can view the slideshow because that's mostly what we're going to be working off of this morning. So a guide for structuring extemp areas of analysis. So just starting off with a bit of a refresher as to what the basic structure of an argument looks like across all speech and debate events. You've probably heard this one before. It's called claim, warrant, and impact. Those are the component parts of a complete argument in any form of debate. Which is also what's happening when you're giving an extemporaneous speech as well. So just really briefly, the claim is the argumentative statement or the central thesis of what's being talked about. The warrant is the reason behind the claim or the substantiation or reason why the claim is true. And then finally, there's an impact, which is of course the reason why the argument matters. Interestingly enough, every extemporaneous speech and every area of analysis should be basically broken up into claim, warrant, and impact. But how we actually make that happen in an extemporaneous speech looks a little bit different than what it might look like in a public forum debate round or a policy debate round. So let's move forward a little bit and port the argument structure into an extemp point. So using the same idea of claim, warrant, and impact, this also exists in an extemp point. So your claim is going to be your contention tagline, right? The thing that you're going to preview at the beginning of the speech and are going to be the three major reasons to support whatever answer you're giving to the question that you've been asked. Your warrants are going to come in the form of subpoints A and subpoints B of your extemp speech. And then finally, your impact is always going to take place as subpoint C. And so what you'll typically see from advanced extempers is that each of their areas of analysis are going to function as an ABC substructure for all of their speeches. But then what those subpoints might look like, particularly in subpoints A and B, are going to vary quite a bit just depending on the verbiage of the question and what needs to be accomplished in order to fairly answer the question that's been asked. So let's dive in a little bit further into that. While this is not, an exhaustive account of how a person can approach an extemp question, by and large, there are two different ways to structure the warrants in an extemp speech. And if you learn these two methods, you're going to be well prepared to grapple with the vast majority of questions that you could ever see in an extemp round. The first substructure method that we're going to talk about is called problem solution. So you might be asking yourself, when do I use the problem solution structure? Well, that's pretty straightforward. It's whenever the question asks for how to solve an issue. Wow, that really does make sense, right? So here are a few examples of questions that you might see in extemp rounds that are, set up as problem solution type questions, or rather questions that the problem solution structure would work out best in order to grapple with the question that you're answering. So first, the question might be, what steps can the federal government take to reduce tax evasion by the wealthy? There's clearly a problem here, and then you're going to posit a solution to that problem. Second, how should the United States respond to a recent spike in COVID cases? And then finally, what changes should be made to increasing voting accessibility? So these are all three great examples for how problem solution structure would easily answer the questions that have been asked. So looking forward a little bit more into this, how to structure the problem solution warrant. The first thing that you're going to do, your subpoint A, is going to be the problem. And then the guiding question that you're going to use to structure subpoint A is going to be, what is one issue causing the event talked about in the question? So you're going to pinpoint specifically what caused this issue And then in the second part, your subpoint B, you're going to posit a solution. How can we specifically address this issue? Or what can specifically be done about the problem and the thing that caused the event that's in question? So then let's go ahead and take a look at this problem solution structure for a specific question and give you a potential example for a good point to answer the question. So let's say that our question was, how can the United States improve vaccine distribution? Well, one great idea for an area of analysis for this question would be to make a point about establishing community vaccine centers, right? So that would be the tagline that we would give in our Extemp speech. Now, in terms of the problem solution structure, our subpoint A is going to be the problem. In this instance, the problem is going to be access to vaccines are unequal. And then there is a New York Times article from the 2nd of January that indicates that 40 million Americans don't have consistent access to pharmacies or a primary place where vaccines are distributed. So then the solution would take place in our subpoint B, which would be to establish community vaccine centers. A Center for American Progress article on January 19th indicates that by giving these routes to similar and more rural areas, a significant subset of the population can get access to vaccines. Then finally, you would give an impact, which of course isn't the focal point of the conversation that we're having today, but it might be fair to say something like the impact of this area of analysis would be expanding access to vaccines for marginalized populations, which would obviously be a really great thing. So this is an example as how you could use problem and solution to approach a question that clearly calls for it. Secondly, let's take a look quickly at the alternative substructural method that I teach all of my students, which is status quo and change. So when would you use the status quo change structure for Extemp speeches? Well, the answer is when you are predicting the effects of a future event, which is frequently what you get asked in extemporaneous speaking rounds, is for you to predict what's going to happen next. So some easy examples would look like things like, first, will North Korean denuclearization happen? Second, will DC become a state in 2021? Third, how will Atlanta shootings impact the fight for civil rights in the United States? Clearly, these are all examples of questions that are asking you to predict what might happen, sometime in the future. So structuring the status quo change type of area of analysis. So for your subpoint A, which is going to be the status quo, you are going to talk at length about what is happening right now, currently. And then in your subpoint B, you're going to talk specifically about the change. What actions are being taken to change the situation? What is being changed? And you can also think about what would be the best ways we could go about changing the status quo in order to, affect a positive result. So in this instance, you can see that in terms of warranting your argument, instead of, problem solution, instead we're going to take a look at status quo change. What's happening right now, and then what's being shifted or changing in the status quo in order to, affect this question. Let's take a look at an example of status quo and change and how this could actually work on a real Extemp question. So for the time being, let's pretend that we're all back in October of 2020 and we are on the cusp of the presidential election. And I'm sure that all of you who are watching this video probably answered many, many questions about what would happen if Joe Biden won or what would happen if President Trump was reelected, right? So in this instance, our question would be, how would the election of Joe Biden impact the future of US foreign policy? Well, let's go ahead and take the idea of problem solution structure and then put this into an area of analysis about this specific question. So our claim, our central thesis of our argument here, and our point one might be that the election of Joe Biden would increase multilateralism. So then for subpoint A, which is going to be our status quo, we would talk about in the status quo, which was, of course, October of 2020 under a Trump presidency, that we were experiencing isolationist policies, right? So excuse the typo, but a foreign policy article from October 21st says that with Trump's America First mentality, the United States has increasingly become more isolated, right? We've been pulling out of international treaties, becoming, increasingly sort of like America first, right? And so that was sort of the state of the nation and our status quo, in October of 2020. Subpoint B, which is going to be that sort of change, is going to say, that electing Biden means that there's going to be a lot more multilateralism that in terms of U.S. foreign policy, right? So a Brookings article tells us that Biden has already championed initiatives like the Paris Climate Accords as a means to foster international cooperation. And again, while we won't dig super far into the impact, probably on like a multilateralism point, a fair impact might be talking about how a shift to increased multilateralism will strengthen our strategic allies and will possibly increase our sort of strategic partnerships and decision making on a international level. So if we put all of this together, the takeaway here is that each of your areas of analysis in your Extemp speech should have three distinct subpoints. Subpoints A and B can basically take on two different forms. You can either go with problem and then the solution, or you can go with the status quo and the change. And either way, these are mechanisms that you're going to use to warrant the claim, which is your contention tagline, or rather your area of analysis tagline. And then finally, subpoint C is going to be the impact. Very frequently in Extemp rounds, the impact is going to be referred to as the implication. I think that this kind of helps distance the extemporaneous speech from the debate jargon that takes place in a lot of sort of technical line-by-line debate events, right? But if you hear the idea of implication, this is sort of interchangeable for an impact within the context of extemporaneous speaking. So if you enjoyed what you've heard this morning, both Angela and I are going to be working at the ISD debate camp this summer, and we would love to talk to you a lot more about advanced Extemp techniques and push this idea further and introduce to you more nuanced ideas as to how to grapple with a question. So registration is currently open, and we'd certainly love to see some of you this summer. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand things off to Angela Wang. She's a current Plano West student and also happens to be the defending national champion in international Extemp. So I hope that all of you got a little bit of something out of this presentation this morning, and I wish all of you the best of luck at NIETOC this weekend. Go kill it. I know that you're going to be great, and I hope that you have a really great time as well.
After 3 years of a completely disastrous terrorist response, the Malian government decided that for the fourth year in a row in 2021, they would do absolutely nothing to reform it, showing that they truly learned from the age-old lesson. Don't make the same mistake twice, make it 4 times. And yet it seems that the mistakes of the Malian government are finally catching up to them. In fact, as the Norwegian Refugee Council actually quantified earlier this year in January, that over 80,000 Malian citizens have already been forced to flee their homes due to the rise of extremist threats within the region of West Africa and the country of Mali. Indeed, within the region, we've already seen groups from branches such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and even regionalized groups such as Ansar al-Sharia all pop up and crop up across the region, perpetuating further violence. And yet the government still hasn't really done anything to try to address it. And so, considering that as a direct result of these extremist threats, thousands of Malian citizens have not only have to put their life on hold, but also put their life at risk, it becomes imperative that we ask today's question. How can Mali more effectively address extremist threats in West Africa? And the answer is that they actually have to take concrete reforms that will address root causes in 3 key ways. First is by bolstering youth employment programs. Second is by increasing intelligence gathering in the desert. And lastly, is by protecting gold production sites. Now, when Americans think about terrorism, we don't usually associate it with the concept of jobs, but that's actually precisely the first step that Mali must take in order to effectively address these extremist threats in West Africa, is by bolstering youth employment programs. In fact, as a UN Development Office program survey actually found back in November of 2020, that 13% of all young citizens who get recruited by terrorist groups say that they're recruited in the first place because of the prospect of employment opportunities. And it's not actually that hard to understand within the country of Mali. Indeed, for a country where their youth unemployment rates are 12% higher than the national average, clearly if they don't actually have economic opportunity elsewhere, then they're just going to go ahead and join terrorist groups. Therefore, if the Malian government actually wants to combat the threat of extremism, then they have to stop this flow of recruitment by providing their youth with other employment opportunities. And this is further highlighted to us by the International Labour Organization in November of last year, articulating that Mali actually did previously have really strong youth employment programs turned towards their National Fund for Youth Employment, something employed in the early 2000s that actually was successful at employing over 700 Malian youth into the country because they provided them with professional development programs. Therefore, if Mali turns towards these similar type of youth employment and development programs, employing it across the country to help Malian youth actually get a job, then it means that they're not going to turn towards terrorists, and they will then stem that flow of recruitment, demonstrating that by stopping the flow of recruitment, clearly they can combat extremist threats. And yet, for many of these extremist groups, their homeland is in the desert, highlighting the second way that the Malian government can combat the threat of extremism in West Africa is by having more intelligence gathering in the desert. Reuters first articulates this to us in April 19th of last year, demonstrating that right now a lot of these Malian military troops are oftentimes deployed in very big cities. For example, very recently, they actually moved over 300 new troops to the northern city of Kidal. However, the only issue with this is that though, of course, citizens will now have more protection, it means that it leaves the desert completely barren and easy to be exploited by terrorist groups. In fact, oftentimes terrorist groups within Mali will use these deserted regions to plot their next attacks, and they're oftentimes called hotspot regions. So instead, the Malian government needs to have a response. In fact, as the Wall Street Journal only further finds, in January 30th of 2021, that the Malian government needs to increase their intelligence gathering within these regions, because it's oftentimes within these deserted regions where these groups are able to recollect their intelligence and actually plan their next attack. Therefore, the government needs to now change their military strategy by moving troops within these northern cities into the desert, while also working with their Ministry of Internal Security to try to bolster their type of intelligence gathering, ones in which armed troops can feed intelligence to this ministry to prevent attacks from happening in the first place, demonstrating that if the government moves troops into the desert to prevent these attacks, they can more effectively address extremism. But the last and most critical way that the Malian government can address extremist threats is by protecting gold production sites. As Reuters further explains to us from January 2nd of 2021, that there's actually a $2 billion informal industry of the production of gold within the region of West Africa. But why is this relevant to terrorism? Well, as the article further finds, that many terrorist groups from Al-Qaeda to ISIS and more all actually exploit the gold trade as a means of earning their own profit and thus buying arms and bolstering their operations. In fact, the article further quantifies that in 2018 alone, terrorist groups were able to profit over $34 million on the over 2,000 gold mining sites that exist within the country of Mali, showing that if the government actually wants to address terrorism, they have to definitely stop this flow of money. And that's why, as the crisis group finally articulates to us from February 2nd of 2021, that the government needs to take steps to put their military troops into these gold mining regions and surround them in order to protect them from terrorist raids. This in itself would already halt many of the different raids that terrorists use in order to profit. But even if they don't have enough armed forces to put within this region, the crisis group continues to analyze that the government should at least provide government support to local non-state groups within the region that oftentimes do the protection work of these gold mining sites, demonstrating that if the government stops this flow of money, then they can actually protect against extremism. And so when coming back to today's question, how can Mali stop extremist threats within West Africa? The answer is that they have to make reforms to solve the root causes. First is by bolstering youth employment programs. Second is by increasing intelligence gathering in the desert. And lastly is by protecting gold mining sites. So although they've made more than 4 mistakes in the past, hopefully they can learn from them and actually have a successful future.
Hey all, so my name is Angela Wang. This is the Extemp speech that I recorded for you guys to see today. And just as a reference before we hop in, the question is, how can Mali more effectively address extremist threats in West Africa? So I'll just be giving kind of a deep dive of my own analysis of this speech that I recorded. Okay.
After 3 years of a completely disastrous terrorist response, the Malian government decided that for the 4th year in a row in 2021, they would do absolutely nothing to reform it, showing that they truly learned from the age-old lesson. Don't make the same mistake twice, make it 4 times. And yet it's...
Okay, so just to pause after the HD a little bit, so I will preface by saying that I think this AGD admittedly is slightly canned. I feel like it could be cross-applicable to other speeches, and ideally you usually want your AGD to be pretty specific to the question at hand, one that can't really be applied to too many different ones. However, I think that when you are approaching topics such as terrorism, and the topic does not necessarily like completely confront, or like what you're talking about isn't focusing on like the humanitarian impacts and such, I think it's okay to go down the route where you go like in a more humorous tone, right? I think it's just important that your AGD doesn't explicitly, like never punches down, and you can just obviously never make fun of people who are suffering. So I think that's why this AGD kind of works, and I don't know, it's obviously not the best, but I think it still serves its purpose to kind of give the judge a good laugh. Essentially, don't focus too much on an AGD. It's never going to be the end-all be-all to a speech. It's just to kind of set the tone in the beginning, and that's why I do generally like to go funny over serious, because when a judge is listening to all these speeches in the round, it's just generally a little bit more appealing.
Seems that the mistakes of the Malian government are finally catching up to them. In fact, as the Norwegian Refugee Council actually quantified earlier this year in January, that over 80,000 Malian citizens have already been forced to flee their homes due to the rise of extremist threats within the region of West Africa and the country of Mali. Indeed, within the region, we've already seen groups from branches such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and even regionalized groups such as Ansar al-Sharia all pop up and crop up across the region, perpetuating further violence. And yet the government still hasn't really done anything to try to address it.
Okay, so that's the end of my background before I head into my 6th statement next. I think a couple things I want to note here. So first is that if you can see like the timestamp on the video, it says it's 58 seconds in. Usually you do want your 6th statement to start at 1 minute. That's obviously, like I did go a little over at the end, 7:11, but in general, that's like a good timestamp to start your 6th statement at. I think the second thing I want to note is that I include that statistic at the beginning of the 80,000 plus refugees. In general, I think it's good to include a statistic in every background. It just adds a little bit more detail and just more depth to what you're saying, because you don't want to run the risk of your judge already knowing everything you're saying if you go too broad. So a statistic is always a good way to kind of give your judge some more information and show that you are well-researched and willing to take that extra step. And I guess the last thing is just making sure that I usually try to just say 3 sentences in a background. I think if you add too much extraneous information, it just will run over and stuff. And I know that oftentimes background is just kind of overlooked, but I think it's just important to set the stage, say things that are relevant to the question, and don't overuse that time, because then you run the risk of going top heavy and spending too much time into the beginning of the speech. But yeah.
And so considering that as a direct result of these extremist threats, thousands of Malian citizens have not only have to put their life on hold, but also put their life at risk. it becomes imperative that we ask today's question.
So if you can tell, that SIG statement was a little bit more rhetoric-y. I would usually like to use a statistic in a SIG, but I realized that the statistic I use in my background is probably one that I would have used in a significant statement if it wasn't in my background. So if you don't have a statistic in the significant statement, you can kind of go for rhetoric, parallel structure. But yeah, just a small note about that.
How can Mali more effectively address extremist threats in West Africa? And the answer is that they actually have to take concrete reforms that will address root causes in three key ways. First is by bolstering youth employment programs. Second is by increasing intelligence gathering in the desert. And lastly is by protecting gold production sites.
Okay, so something that I want to note here is kind of the ordering of my taglines. I think that that is really important when you have three of your points. You don't want to just automatically go in the order in which you thought, like you came up with the points. Usually you want to put your most like obvious point at the beginning and a strong one. You want to hide your kind of like weaker point in the middle because usually your judge will be able to like overlook it. And then you want to put your most like unique and probably stronger as well point at the very end. And so personally for myself, I thought, though of course like the youth employment tagline that I said in the beginning might not be the most obvious one, I thought that it was strong. I thought that my like intelligence gathering one was the weakest, so I put it in the middle. And then I thought that the gold production point was the most unique, so that's why I put it in at the end. The second thing I want to note is that the umbrella answer is kind of broad. If you hear what I said, I was like implementing reforms in order to address root causes, which sounds kind of broad, right? But I think it's really important that when you're prepping, you don't first come up with that umbrella and then try to like come up with answers after. I always first come up with my points, and then at the very end, I'll come up with the answer because you never want to constrain yourself before you've even started that prep process. So it's okay to err on the side of having a little bit of a broader umbrella, so long as your points can still be very specific. Okay.
Now, when Americans think about terrorism, we don't usually associate it with the concept of jobs, but that's actually precisely the first step that Mali must take in order to effectively address these extremist threats in West Africa, is by bolstering youth employment programs. In fact, as a UN Development Office program survey actually found back in November of 2020, that 13% of all young citizens who get recruited by terrorist groups say that they're recruited in the first place because of the prospect of employment opportunities. And it's not actually that hard to understand within the country of Mali. Indeed, for a country where their youth unemployment rates are 12% higher than the national average, clearly if they don't actually have economic opportunity elsewhere, then they're just going to go ahead and join terrorist groups. Therefore, if the Malian government actually wants to combat the threat of extremism, then they have to stop this flow of recruitment by providing their youth with other employment opportunities.
So what I want to highlight with this point is that it is admittedly more complex. I think that obviously when you think of fighting terrorism, you automatically resort to like drone strikes or like the actual fighting itself, right? But if you can tell, this point is focusing on a root cause. It's kind of pulls away from your traditional thought process of, and you're like, okay, instead let's look at the recruiting, which comes from the fact that they need jobs. And so I think it's just very important that if you do have points where there is just the logic chain is something that the judge has to be able to follow along. Like for example, if the judge forgot halfway through in my point, like why is she talking about jobs again? Like why is this related to fighting terrorism? Then, you know, obviously that's not good. So I think in points like these, it's really important that you explain your links in a very layman way. Like you never want to, anytime you have like confusing logic, you have to make sure you explain things like as basically as possible, and also with pretty good word economy. Like you have to make sure you don't throw in too many random filler words and phrases and stuff because it's already kind of complicated in the first place and you don't want to make it more complex for no reason. And then the second thing I wanted to highlight, if you heard, there was a sentence I said in there where I said, therefore, if they want to actually fight terrorism, they have to address it by providing employment opportunities. This sentence is very purposeful. I think it's not something to overlook because it kind of summarizes this complex logic that I just said, right? I link it back to the question about fighting terrorism, and then I link it to my answer. I'm like, so in order to fight terrorism, we have to provide these employment opportunities. in which I explain in my B. So I think it's just really important that you provide that transition between the A subpoint and the B subpoint so that it's just this very clear path that the judge is able to follow.
And this is further highlighted to us by the International Labor Organization in November of last year, articulating that Mali actually did previously have really strong youth employment programs turned towards their National Fund for Youth Employment, something employed in the early 2000s that actually was successful at employing over 700 Malian youth into the country because they provided them with professional development programs. Therefore, if Mali turns towards these similar type of youth employment and development programs, employing it across the country to help Malian youth actually get a job, then it means that they're not going to turn towards terrorists, and it will then stem that flow of recruitment, demonstrating that by stopping the flow of recruitment, clearly they can combat extremist threats.
Okay, so once again, another pause here, because that sentence I just said is also incredibly critical. It is, once again, that type of summary sentence that I said. Even for points that are not as convoluted, in which you'll see in the second and third point, I think it's very important to have this summary sentence at the very end of the speech. I think a lot of extempors focus on the C of your point, like ABC substructure, on impacts that extend out of the question, right? Because that's how we learn it. We learn it as claim, warrant, impact. I think, though, it's very important to not get too bogged down in being like, oh, I need my impacts to be very far reaching and like stretching outside of the scope of my point and stuff. Because at the end of the day, for anyone who's ever learned that the first rule to extemp is answering the question, you have to make sure that every point is always just tying back to the question. That's why I think that it's really important that that last sentence says something where it's like showing, and then I summarize what I said, like by stemming the flow of recruitment, we're able to more effectively address extremist threats. I always am saying words verbatim from the question because you want to remind the judge that you are actually answering the question.
And yet, for many of these extremist groups, their homeland is in the desert, highlighting the second way that the Malian government can combat.
So I guess just a small note, that transition was obviously a little odd if you were listening. I just said like terrorist groups have a homeland in the desert. But something I do want to point out is just that transitions are not the most important part of a speech. That obviously wasn't like the highest quality transition, but I just think that if you're able to get down solid content, memorizing your sources, memorizing your statistics, then that matters more than having like the best pre-planned transitions. But just a small note about that.
About the threat of extremism in West Africa is by having more intelligence gathering in the desert. Reuters first articulates this to us in April 19th of last year, demonstrating that right now a lot of these Malian military troops are oftentimes deployed in very big cities. For example, very recently, they actually moved over 300 new troops to the northern city of Kidal. However, the only issue with this is that though, of course, citizens will now have more protection, it means that it leaves the desert completely barren and easy to be exploited by terrorist groups. In fact, oftentimes terrorist groups within Mali will use these deserted regions to plot their next attacks, and they're oftentimes called hotspot regions. So instead, the Malian government needs to have a response.
Okay, so once again, you need to just first set up like why. So you first notice the first sentence I say in that point is setting up just like basic context. It doesn't even have to do with saying this is the problem. I just say a lot of troops are in the north. But right after you say this kind of just broad contextualized sentence, you have to immediately tie it back to, once again, like I said, the question. You have to immediately show why are we talking about this and why is this a problem? That's why if you notice, I think I say verbatim right afterwards, however, the problem with this, and then I tie it straight back to the question. So yeah, that was the structure of the A.
In fact, as the Wall Street Journal only further finds, in January 30th of 2021, that the Malian government needs to increase their intelligence gathering within these regions, because it's oftentimes within these deserted regions where these groups are able to recollect their intelligence and actually plan their next attack. Therefore, the government needs to now change their military strategy by moving troops within these northern cities into the desert, while also working with their Ministry of Internal Security to try to bolster their type of intelligence gathering, ones in which armed troops can feed intelligence to this ministry to prevent attacks from happening in the first place. demonstrating that as the government moves troops into the desert to prevent these attacks, they can more effectively address extremism.
Okay, so a note before we get into the third point. So I personally, like I said at the beginning, think that this point is the weakest, mostly because if you listen to the solution, it is just kind of broad. It's like moving troops in, working with the Ministry of like Security and Intelligence to gather intelligence and stuff. So obviously the strongest of points have the most specific of solutions, but I think it still kind of suffices. I think that in the case that you do have, like, you're struggling to come up with a very specific solution, if you notice, like when I include that line there about the Ministry of Internal Security, that is just a means of showing that I still do have specifics, even if I feel like the actual solution itself, which is just moving troops in, is a little bit broad. So the pro tip here is just that it's always a good idea to search up, like literally what I was Googling is like Malian security agency gathering intelligence about terrorism. So you just want to find kind of those specifics, those little tidbits to throw in your speeches to show that you still do have that level of complexity, even if the logic of the solution itself is a little bit broad. And then just a small little note about why I kind of teleported there. If you noticed, I was here to there. My phone just died in the middle, so these were two different shots. But yeah, let's get into the third point.
But the last and most critical way that the Malian government can address extremist threats is by protecting gold production sites. As Reuters further explains to us from January 2nd of 2021, that there's actually a $2 billion informal industry of the production of gold within the region of West Africa. But why is this relevant to terrorism? Well, as the article further finds, the many terrorist groups from...
Okay, yeah, so I definitely want to note that. So if you notice, I like literally threw in a rhetorical question there. I said, so why does this relate to terrorism? So I think that my take on kind of like rhetorical question asking is that I personally think it works. I don't think it works for everyone. Like, not everyone feels very comfortable doing it. The reason why there are some setbacks to doing this is that some will interpret this as just adding a lot of adding extra fluff and words to a speech that is not necessarily as pertinent or as necessary, right? It's just kind of, I'm just asking a question. It's not actually another level of analysis. However, the reason why I do personally like this is because I think it's one way to connect pretty well with your lay judge, because I also use this kind of sparingly. I'm not going to ask a rhetorical question after every a subpoint of a point, but I did it here because I try to put myself in the perspective of a lay judge. I think that's just a good tip overall, is that anytime you're explaining something, anytime you're like saying statistics, you want to always think about it from the perspective of someone who didn't research it and who doesn't totally understand it. So after I said that one statistic about like $2 billion worth of gold in the informal economy, the reason I put the little rhetorical question right afterwards is because I personally would think, from the perspective of a lay judge, they're probably thinking, why the heck is this girl talking about gold when we're talking about terrorism? Like, that seems to be totally unrelated. So it kind of puts you on their level, and it shows that you are able to consider those things and that you're not just making random links that don't make sense. It shows that you are considering that, like, oh yeah, that might seem kind of random, but like, hold on, we're gonna get there. So in my opinion, my general style of Extemp that I think is it is pretty relatable is just being like conversational and pretending like you are talking with that person. So I think it's just kind of this way to break that fourth wall and be like, I understand your confusion, but we're going to get there. So that's kind of a note about just asking rhetorical questions in your speeches.
Al-Qaeda to ISIS and more all actually exploit the gold trade as a means of earning their own profit and thus buying arms and bolstering their operations. In fact, the article further quantifies that in 2018 alone, terrorist groups were able to profit over $34 million on the over 2,000 gold mining sites that exist within the country of Mali.
And just another small note, the reason why I include this second statistic about $34 million over 2,000 sites, even though I already said this whole like $2 billion statistic, is because I personally felt that the $2 billion statistic was too broad. It didn't show like why specifically terrorist groups profit off of it. So it's always a good idea to, like, two is better than one, always a good idea to kind of make sure your statistics are specific to what you're saying and they're not just too unrelated.
Showing that if the government actually wants to address terrorism, they have to definitely stop this flow of money.
Once again, that was that transition from the A to the B to show why my solution is relevant to the question.
And that's why, as the crisis group finally articulates to us from February 2nd of 2021, that the government needs to take steps to put their military troops into these gold mining regions and surround them in order to protect them from terrorist raids. This in itself would already halt many of the different raids that terrorists use in order to profit. But even if they don't have enough armed forces to put within this region, the crisis group continues to analyze that the government should at least provide government support to local non-state groups within the region that oftentimes do the protection work of these gold mining sites, demonstrating that if the government stops this flow of money, then they can actually protect against extremism.
Okay, so a note about this solution here. I cite the crisis group because their article specifically says, like, because we are facing this issue in Mali, here is a solution the government should take. The thing is, articles like this are oftentimes pretty darn hard to find. Like, you're not going to have a whole bunch of articles that are literally telling you, like, here are all the specific solutions to implement. So that's why sometimes if you can't find a source that's exactly telling you, like, here are the steps to implement in the face of this issue, you should just find sources that show, like, instead these solutions being implemented into the real world and working in different parts. Like, for example, one of my favorite ones is, like, I remember I was doing a speech about elections and I was saying, like, this type of solution thing that I thought of. So then I Googled it and I was like, oh, like, it was like UN election monitoring in success stories. And then you find that it has worked in other countries and then you can use that source. But yeah, that's just a note about the solution.
And so when coming back to today's question, how can Mali stop extremist threats within West Africa?
Okay, so a note about this is that this is non-verbatim what I said at the beginning. I said, how can Mali more effectively address extremist threats in West Africa? I think I just said, how can Mali stop extremist threats? So obviously that is not ideal. You need to say at least the question verbatim in the beginning, in the question in the intro. If you just forget it in the conclusion, like, I thought it was just better for me to continue and not just like blunder through it, because that is just going to make you more nervous and less likely to even remember it. So though of course that was not ideal, I think you just, best thing to do in the scenario when you don't remember, just keep your composure, move on, it'll be fine.
The answer is that they have to make reforms to solve the root causes. First is by bolstering youth employment programs. Second is by increasing intelligence gathering in the desert. And lastly is by protecting gold mining sites. So although they've made more than 4 mistakes in the past, hopefully they can learn from them and actually have a successful future.
Okay, so I personally didn't really like that, what is it called, zinger. I thought that it was a little bit too rushed, or it wasn't pre-planned very well. The most optimal situation is that you come up with more of a wittier line, or at least are a little bit more pre-planned. But I guess what I want to highlight here, why I'm saying all this, is because your transitions and your zinger, though of course are important, if they come in conflict with your prep time in terms of like memorizing the question, memorizing sources, or even your links and statistics, don't prioritize that. That's why like you can get by with kind of a little bit less pre-planned transitions and conclusions, but of course you can't get by without even memorizing your actual content. So that was just a small note about that. And then I guess just another note, or the last note I'll make about this speech, is that the probably biggest tip that I can give any extemper is to try your best to really pretend like you are talking with your judge. No judge wants to be talked at, but you want to pretend like you're talking with them, right? And so I think just like small tips to do this is like practice giving speeches where you are literally talking to someone, or you're sitting down, walking around. But also something else is being willing to smile. That's something that a lot of extempers don't do, is just they go straight face throughout and they're super, super serious. But judges do really want those small points of levity and just knowing that you are still a human and that you're not just like a professor lecturing them about something. So yeah, hopefully that was all helpful. And yeah,